Thanks for taking the time to talk with us about this. The purpose of this is to tell the NCLII scholars about the work that you do and how it kind of fits into alternative ways of thinking about intensive intervention. So, when you think about database individualization, I think that most folks characterize it as what we call like an idiopathic way of thinking about intensive intervention, and that it's very individually specialized. But we also know that many researchers in special education take kind of a nomothetic approach where they design things more at the group level. And so it sort of creates this sort of interesting contrast in the way different types of special education researchers do their work. And we all think of ourselves as doing intensive intervention. And the purpose of this is kind of ask you about your own work in relation to all of this and to see how you think your work fits into this and fits into the idea of intensive intervention.
Great, sounds good.
Okay, so first question for you is, would you characterize your work as taking a nomothetic or idiopathic approach to designing and implementing interventions for students with disabilities?
Okay. In some ways, I think it maybe is a little bit of a false dichotomy to think that these are kind of completely different or very different things. So, and since I think they're probably a little probably all thinking a little bit more similar about this than that. But I guess for the purpose of this, I'm supposed to be.
Well, problematize it for us too, right?
Yeah.
This is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I guess, based on the definition you talked about, but I would think about myself as a little bit more nomothetic and thinking about individualizing or tailoring intervention or intensifying intervention for individual kids based on an approach that was developed for a group of kids, right? So instead of developing an intervention specifically for an individual student, starting with an approach that was designed to benefit a larger group of students, and then individualizing and tailoring or intensifying that for an individual student. And I don't know, maybe that's like kind of semantics, but I think the way that sometimes folks in the field think about it is this idea that, the sort of individualizing piece means that you kind of, that student has unique needs that are going to be different from like most any other kid that are experiencing the same difficulties. And so you kind of not start from scratch necessarily, but that student's need is so unique that it's very different from other students.
Right.
But I think, in some ways that when we think about, say, reading difficulties, that, there may be sort of these kind of broad constellations of needs. That kids have pretty much the same profiles in terms of the kinds of reading skills that they're working on. And maybe the thing that's different about it is less that they need a kind of individualized approach, but they need a sort of tailored or intensive approach that's built off of something that was developed for a larger group of kids.
Say more about that. I think that's a really interesting piece.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about kind of reading difficulties, there's probably kind of a couple of broad areas, right? So there's kids that have difficulty with code,
by code, you mean like the phonics, the sounding out of words,
awareness,
and so on.
the phonemic awareness. Then there's kids that might have more difficulty with kind of language or comprehension kinds of things, like simple food. And so interventions tend to be kind of developed focusing on one of those kind of areas. Those are the kinds of things that most kids are going to benefit from.
Right.
So, there's not like different content necessarily that kids need to learn. It's pretty much the same content. And so say you develop a code-based intervention for a student or a group of students that have needs in that area. The kinds of things that you would see in that intervention, focus on phonics or phonemic awareness or fluency, those are going to be the needs of pretty much most kids that have that profile. And so if they're, in terms of tailoring it for an individual kid, it would be less like those things don't work for that kid. It's more like, how do we make that more intensive and more supportive for that student, right? So in a sense, I guess I would think more about starting from a kind of standardized protocol intervention and thinking about tweaking the components of that to make it more appropriate for individual students rather than kind of coming from the other way around. And again, I don't think that's inconsistent with what folks have been doing with their DEI.
Right.
But I think of it probably more as making sure that this approach that's designed to work for a group of kids is going to work for that individual kid, rather than thinking of designing something very different for an individual kid that's not similar to what's going to work for a group of kids.
Yeah, that makes very good sense. So the second question is, has your research changed the way you think about the students you study? We're thinking here about the idea that the best way to understand something is to try to change it. So has your work changed the way you think specifically about idiopathic versus nomothetic approaches?
Yes, and I think the first thing that I think about is just some research that we've done recently, and this was a talk that gave at the NCLII, so folks may remember this study. But what we did is we looked at a Tier 2 intervention program that was designed for generally kids that were having, kindergarten kids that are having difficulty with early reading. And what we did is for students that were not responding, what we tried to think of ways to intensify the intervention within the context of the program or of the intervention, rather than sort of shifting to developing sort of individualized plans for kids. And what we did is what we kind of kept within the program, but we adjusted things like regrouping based on kids' response and where they were. Progressing through the program based on whether groups were mastering content or not. So sometimes we would repeat lessons if kids were having, a particular group was having trouble with that. And so I think what I came away from that study with, and the idea, the results were that the kids that actually were in the intervention where it was, that the intervention itself was adjusted for groups of kids based on their response, those kids did better and responded more strongly than the kids that sort of had that kind of version of the intervention where they just moved through the program, kind of one lesson per day.
Right.
And I guess what I took away from that is that there's still a lot we can do to improve the quality of our interventions that are designed to target groups of kids. We can strengthen those kind of interventions so that they are more effective with a wider range of students if we do some things within the context of those programs that in a sense are responsive to individual kids, but without sort of shifting over to an individualized approach. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but this idea that we can build in things to our programs where they are more responsive by adding things like opportunities to respond, corrective feedback, additional modeling kind of procedures that are generally going to benefit all kids, and increasing the intensity of those kinds of features are going to benefit the sort of general profile of kids who are not responding. And so I guess I see that a little bit more as nomothetic, in that it's focusing on making the broader approach more effective rather than shifting to an individual approach.
I want to pick up on that with the third question, which is about your intervention with reference to kids without a need for intensive intervention. So you mentioned this idea that some of these things like opportunity to respond work for all kids. So if you think that these can be applied to all kids, even kids without intensive interventions, do you do that? If not, what would be the reason not to do that for kids without intensive needs?
Yeah, I can't think of any sort of reason why this type of approach would not work for kids without intensive needs. As long as, as within the approach itself or within a program, I guess, there's the ability to kind of continually adjusting some of these features so that it's matched to the needs of different levels of kids. Right, holding kids back in an intervention program after they've already mastered content doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But it actually reminds me of this story when this was earlier study in the same program of research looking at this kindergarten intervention program. And we've been working with this district to try to get them to change their instruction in kindergarten around finding some more kind of direct explicit instruction in early reading. And they don't want to do that.
Okay.
But they were open to the intervention.
Okay.
Right? The struggling kids, it was fine for them to
Yeah,
have the intervention.
yeah.
So we were working with them on doing the intervention. A lot of these kindergarten teachers were actually the ones who were interventionists for this program.
Mhm.
And the group of teachers at one school at some point in the study said, is this something we could do with our whole class? They had no idea that this was what we were talking about, is that they should actually be doing with their whole class. And they meant, like, can we do this intervention program with the whole class?
Right.
And so it just sort of shows that, good instruction is good instruction. And as long as it's aligned correctly, I think. I'm not sure if that's exactly what the question
Yeah,
is.
yeah. I mean, well, I think that's the alignment piece that's kind of maybe the key there, right? I think you were kind of getting this idea, maybe you can say more about this after I make the comment, that it depends whether this is helpful. Obviously opportunities to respond are going to help kids, but, if a kid can learn just as much, reading something on their own, maybe you just do that instead, because you could do more opportunities to respond, but there's another way to do it that maybe is even more efficient for kids with typical achievement or
Right.
something. Like these things could work for everybody, but maybe you don't need to do it for everybody. I don't know if that's.
Yeah. And I guess this is where, in some ways, thinking about a nomothetic approach, I'm getting better at saying that.
Good,
Yeah.
yes.
Can be in some ways a more sort of efficient framework for thinking about supports for all kids. Because the sort of thing in education is you can't differentiate or individualize for every single kid in the school. You can't have 21 individualized reading instructional plans starting from scratch for every kid.
Right.
But what you could think about is taking approaches that you have confidence are going to be generally appropriate for large groups of kids, and then working within those approaches to make it so it's aligned for individuals. So I think in some ways, kind of thinking about starting with a consistent approach that targets areas of content that we know all kids need, and teaching those with principles of effective design and delivery that we know are effective with all kids.
Yep.
And then working within that framework to kind of align things with the trajectories of groups of kids. And probably there's going to be multiple kids that are on similar trajectories.
Yep.
And even those kids who really are having the most difficulty responding, that we would think of as the sort of tier 3 supports or intensive interventions, I guess in some ways they'll still be getting the same approach and the same content, but the sort of the level of intensification of the content and the instructional design features are going to just be ramped up to a higher level.
Got it. Okay. Yep, that makes sense. So in terms of, I guess, both the instructional design features and sort of the content, that brings me to kind of the future a little bit. So we're learning more about cognition, human development, and do you think that as we learn more about that, that will send us in a more idiopathic direction or a more nomothetic direction, because we learn more about either how we should design the content or how we should deliver, have the instructional design features or something else. So do you think we're going to see a change in one way or the other in the future?
Well, I hope that we'll be able to see progression in sort of both areas. That we'll still get better at figuring out how to deliver instruction and a kind of instructional design, science of instructional design, I guess. That there's a lot of work to be done with that, and with things like technology and other ways to deliver instruction. I think there's a lot of area for growth there. And I do think we'll probably learn more about sort of individual profiles of kids where we can do a better job of matching instruction to students' needs, based on more knowledge about the learning process. So I mean, I'm not sure that we're going to lead to this where one approach is going to sort of become the norm and the other one's going to kind of go away. But I think we want to that we have research and progress in both trying to make things better generally for everyone, or generally better for kids that need more intensive supports, and being better able to align those supports to individual kids' needs. So that's my wishy-washy on the fence answer for.
But also that last sentence was really elegant too, so that was really good. So with regard to all of those things in terms of in reading, in instructional design features, all those things, what is very important and understudied that you think is something that maybe NCOII scholars should start to think about doing in their own work?
Well, I guess we're sort of on a design of instruction theme, so I guess I'll stick with that.
Go with that.
Which is that more research, I guess, on this science of instructional design and delivery, where it seems like we do a lot of work with trying to kind of profile students' individual differences, and also maybe kind of focus on specific content, but that we don't think enough about how we communicate or teach that content in a way that's more effective and necessary for kids with intensive needs. So the sort of research on things like what are the active ingredients of these interventions that make them more effective and efficient in communicating the content to these students. So those kind of things like experimentally manipulating things like modeling or feedback or pacing or opportunity to respond, and within the context of different sort of academic domains. So that we're not looking at in sort of general, but we're looking at, say, existing intervention programs and saying, what can we do to this to make it more effective for a broader range of kids.
I want to thank you both for taking the time to talk about this. I think the scholars would benefit from hearing your perspective. Before we end here, is there any other kind of parting words you'd like to share with the scholars?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But I'm happy to follow up with anybody if it's just really interesting kind of conversation and questions, and just broadly with this module. So
yeah,
I'm interested in continuing the conversation.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.